High in the heart of the mountains stood the kingdom of Ndora, where the sound of hammers and anvils filled the air like a never-ending heartbeat. Smoke rose from furnaces that never slept, and the scent of molten iron clung to the wind. The people of Ndora were born with calloused hands and soot in their lungs. Here, chains were not just tools, they were symbols of service, strength, and submission. The miners wore them as belts, the soldiers carried them as marks of honor, and the slaves bore them as reminders of their silence. It was a kingdom built on iron and obedience, where every clang of metal was both creation and captivity. Among the endless line of workers, a young woman named Kalima bent over the forge. She was 22, her skin bronze and glowing with the reflection of firelight, her arms strong from years of shaping metal. The air around her shimmered with heat, but her gaze was colder than steel. Her wrists bore the marks of chains, deep scars that refused to fade, no matter how many seasons passed. Yet her eyes, sharp as polished blades, carried something the overseers could not crush: defiance. Kalima was known among the laborers as the girl who never broke, no matter how heavy the chains became. Her father, Baru, had once been the master blacksmith of Ndora. His hands had crafted the crown that rested on King Abadil's head, a crown of black iron laced with veins of gold. But when the king demanded chains stronger than any metal known to bind those who dared question him, Baru refused. "Chains can hold flesh," he had said, "but they cannot hold the will." For those words, he was executed beneath the palace gates, his body left hanging from the very iron he had once shaped. Kalima had been 13 then, and she never forgot the sound of the crowd's silence as his lifeless body swung in the mountain wind. Now, years later, she worked in the same mines where her father once stood, shaping the same cursed metal that had taken his life. But she did not curse the iron. Each night, when the guards retreated and the fires dimmed, Kalima would whisper to the chains she made. She believed that metal remembered. That every strike of her hammer carried a story: the suffering of her people, the resistance of her father, the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Sometimes, when the forge grew quiet, she could almost hear it hum back to her, faint and alive as if the iron was listening. The kingdom above ground glittered with wealth, but beneath it, in the mines, the people were ghosts of flesh and sweat. Chains clattered like rainfall, and yet Kalima's heart burned like molten fire. She had begun to notice something strange in her work. The chains she forged seemed to change color under her touch, darkening to a hue no other blacksmith could replicate. They were lighter too, almost as if they resisted being used to imprison. She hid them, weaving them secretly into her work, whispering old mountain prayers as she cooled them in sacred water stolen from the temple wells. The overseers mocked her quiet persistence, calling her the Iron Witch. But Kalima only smiled beneath the soot. For she knew something none of them did: the chains of Ndora were not born to hold forever. Somewhere deep inside the mountain, beyond the tunnels of labor and despair, the earth itself was stirring. And in the rhythm of her hammer, Kalima began to feel it. The chains were speaking to her, carrying the memory of her father's defiance. They did not crave to bind, they yearned to break. In the kingdom of iron and silence, where every sound was controlled and every dream forbidden, Kalima's forge became a secret heartbeat of rebellion. She was not just shaping metal anymore, she was shaping destiny. Among the villagers was a girl whose presence seemed to brighten even the gloomiest dawns. Imani, the daughter of the late queen, was known for her kindness and the serenity in her voice. Her laughter carried warmth, her eyes held calm wisdom far beyond her years, and her touch was said to bring good fortune. To the miners who passed her on their way to the hills, she was a symbol of purity, a reminder of the gentleness their harsh world often forgot. Children ran to her for stories and elders blessed her when she passed. But for one woman, her stepmother Muna, Imani's light was a wound that refused to heal. Muna was a beauty sculpted in shadow. Her face was flawless, her words like honey laced with venom. When she first married Imani's father, the king of Ashira, she had smiled sweetly and played the part of a loving mother. But as the years passed and the king's affection for his daughter grew, Muna's jealousy began to coil around her heart. She would watch Imani from the palace balcony, her fingers tightening around the silver bracelets that jingled softly on her wrist. Each time the people praised the girl, Muna's smile would falter, her envy deepening like cracks in porcelain. The palace, made of white stone and adorned with silver carvings, gleamed brighter than the rest of the village. It was said the walls themselves could catch sunlight and turn it into fire. Inside, servants hurried through long corridors, polishing silver vases, trays, and mirrors until they reflected every face that passed. And in those reflections Muna often saw herself, beautiful, yes, but overshadowed. No matter how she adorned herself with jewels or wore the finest silks, the reflection that haunted her was not her own. It was Imani's innocent smile that lingered in her mind like a curse. Imani, oblivious to her stepmother's festering envy, spent her days tending to the palace gardens. She would hum softly as she watered the lilies by the fountains, the sound like a prayer carried by the wind. Birds often perched near her as if listening. Even the servants found comfort in her presence. To them, she was the last living piece of the late queen's grace, and they whispered blessings for her safety, though none could protect her from what brewed behind Muna's perfect smile. At night, the village lights shimmered against the hills, reflecting on the river that cut through Ashira like a silver thread. Imani loved to watch it from her window, imagining that it connected her to her mother's spirit. But beneath that same moonlight, Muna stood in her private chamber, staring at a chest filled with silver coins, the tribute from the mines. Her reflection in the coins twisted, the light bending across her face. The shine of silver filled her eyes with longing. She could almost taste the power it brought. But when she thought of Imani, her hands clenched into fists. How could a mere girl, a child not of her blood, hold the love of the people, the admiration of the king, and the spirit of the land? Whispers began to follow Muna wherever she went. Some said she visited the miners at night, taking secret offerings. Others claimed she spoke to a traveling merchant known for dark dealings. None dared question her directly, for her words could turn kindness into suspicion and trust into ruin. In her heart, greed bloomed like poison. Silver had always been the pride of Ashira, but to Muna, it was something far more dangerous. It was proof that beauty and wealth could bend fate itself, if one was ruthless enough to claim it. Imani noticed the change first not in words but in silences. The way Muna's laughter disappeared when she entered a room. The way her father avoided meeting her eyes during meals, lost in his own exhaustion and the weight of royal duties. The palace felt colder, the silver ornaments seemed to lose their warmth. Even the servants began to move quietly, their glances uneasy. Imani felt something in her chest, a tightening, a quiet warning that the peace she knew was thinning like silk about to tear. And above it all, the mines continued to hum, the sound echoing through the land like a heartbeat. The villagers prayed for another year of abundance, but the river that carried silver dust into the valley ran darker each day, as though it reflected not sunlight but sorrow. Deep in her chambers, Muna whispered to herself as she traced her reflection in a polished coin. "Silver never lies," she murmured. "It shows what power truly looks like." But in the quiet stillness of the palace that night, the walls seemed to murmur in return, a faint echo, almost like a warning. "The same silver you worship will remember your touch." The air grew heavy, and though Muna did not yet know it, the very thing she adored, the shining veins of silver beneath Ashira's soil, was already weaving her downfall. The mountain kingdom awoke to the sound of drums and decree. King Abadil, ruler of Ndora, had announced a sacred commission, the forging of a new set of royal chains, meant to bind not just men but spirits. Priests said the gods themselves had whispered the idea into the king's ear after he dreamt of rebels rising from the mines. These chains, the king proclaimed, would seal the kingdom's fate in unbreakable loyalty. They would be placed upon his throne, his guards, even his own wrists during coronations, symbols of divine power and eternal rule. Every blacksmith in Ndora was summoned to the palace foundry, their forges roaring with competition. Yet only one name was chosen, Kalima. The same young woman who forged faster, cleaner, and with more heart than any craftsman in the mountains. Some said she inherited her father's cursed talent. Others whispered that her touch was guided by the restless spirits of iron. When the royal messenger came to the mines, even the overseers fell silent. Kalima stood among them, soot-stained and steady, her gaze unflinching. "The king commands your hands," the messenger said. "You will forge what none before have dared." Kalima bowed, but inside her heart beat with unease. To forge the king's sacred chains was an honor that often ended as a curse. Her father had once stood in this very place before being executed for defiance. As she entered the royal forge, the scent of molten metal and incense hung thick in the air. Gold idols watched her from the walls, their eyes carved with suspicion. Guards stood like shadows at the edge of the chamber, their armor gleaming under the heat. The anvil before her was ancient, carved from a fallen meteor, its surface marked by generations of blood and brilliance. When the first ingots of metal were poured, the forge seemed to breathe. The flames hissed, and Kalima's hammer hesitated midair, because she heard it. A whisper. Faint like wind over stone. A voice that spoke her father's name. Baru. The sound drifted through the smoke, wrapping around her like memory. Her hand trembled, but she lifted the hammer again and struck. Sparks burst like stars. The whisper came again, stronger this time, woven into the rhythm of her labor. Do not forge their chains, child. Forge their fate. Her breath caught, but she said nothing. She knew the walls had ears, that priests and spies might be listening. So she continued to strike, once for obedience, once for defiance. The molten metal pulsed beneath her hammer, alive with something ancient. It shimmered not gold, not silver, but a color she had never seen before, the soft glow of dawn after a night too long endured. Every blow of her hammer sang like prophecy, each ring echoing through the mountain halls. Even the guards shifted uneasily, sensing something beyond their understanding. Days turned into nights and Kalima did not sleep. Her hands bled, her body ached, but her spirit burned brighter than the forge. The whispers grew clearer, forming words she could almost understand, fragments of her father's wisdom, prayers he once murmured as he shaped metal that breathed. The chains began to take form, delicate yet unyielding, intricate as woven silk yet stronger than the deepest ore. Each link was a mystery, forged with rhythm and intention only Kalima could feel. It was as if the mountain itself was guiding her hands, channeling the will of something greater. When the final link cooled, the king himself came to witness the creation. The air thickened as King Abadil stepped forward, his robe trailing embers from the braziers. "Show me," he commanded. Kalima lifted the chains with reverence, their glow filling the chamber with an ethereal light, not blinding but alive. The color was neither gold nor silver, neither bronze nor steel. It was the color of the horizon just before sunrise, a light born from both darkness and hope. The priests gasped and fell to their knees. "The color of rebirth," one murmured. "The blessing of dawn." King Abadil smiled, his teeth sharp as blades. "Perfect," he said. "Chains worthy of the gods." He reached to touch them and flinched. For a brief instant, the metal pulsed under his fingers as though it recognized his corruption. The light dimmed, then steadied. None but Kalima saw how it recoiled from him. She bowed, hiding the faint smile on her lips. The chains were complete, but not his to command. The metal carried her father's spirit, her own defiance, and the memory of every soul bound beneath the mountain. They gleamed with the promise of a dawn yet to come, and though the king thought he had bound the world, Kalima knew she had forged its key. The king's court gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling of the iron hall, their eyes gleaming like polished blades. Word had spread across the kingdom of Ndora, whispers that the sacred chains forged by Kalima carried more than craftsmanship. Some said they shimmered strangely when moonlight touched them. Others claimed they pulsed like a heartbeat, refusing to rest in stillness. It was enough to ignite suspicion in the mind of King Abadil, who trusted no one but his cunning advisor, Moke. Moke was a thin man with eyes as sharp as daggers and a voice that dripped poison disguised as loyalty. He bowed low before the throne, the sacred chains draped across his hands. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "these are no mere bindings of iron. I felt them stir as though they breathed. The girl has cursed them. She has bound not your enemies but you." The court erupted in murmurs. Kalima, standing at the edge of the chamber with soot still streaked across her face, raised her chin. "I forged them as commanded," she said, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "If they move, it is because the mountain remembers its fire." Moke smiled. "Or perhaps," he said, turning to the king, "because the spirit of her dead father whispers through them. The same rebel you had executed for treason. Perhaps she seeks to finish what he began." King Abadil's face hardened like cooled steel. He rose from his throne, the light of the forge flickering across his crown. "You dare bring rebellion into my forge?" His voice thundered through the hall. Kalima dropped to her knees, not in fear but in exhaustion, from days of labor, from the weight of injustice pressing against her chest. "I forged no rebellion," she whispered. "Only truth." But truth had no place in the king's court. Moke's voice slithered again. "Then let her wear her truth." And so it was decreed. Kalima was to be bound in her own creation, the sacred chains that shimmered like dawn. The forge that had been her sanctuary became her prison. The guards dragged her to the center of the hall as the priests chanted blessings twisted into curses. When the first ring of metal clasped around her wrists, the sound echoed like thunder rolling through caverns. The air itself trembled. Kalima did not cry out. Her skin burned where the chains touched, but beneath the pain was something stranger, a pulse, a rhythm. A faint, steady hum that thrummed against her bones like a heartbeat. The metal was alive. The whispers she had heard while forging returned, faint but familiar. her father's voice again woven into the steel, "Do not fear what binds you, my child. For what binds can also break." Outside the palace, word spread quickly. The villagers of Ndora, miners, smiths, laborers, gathered in the streets as soldiers marched her through the mountain paths. Mothers clutched their children, men bowed their heads in silence. Kalima's feet left prints of soot and blood along the cobblestones. The chains around her glimmered with the faint light of dawn, drawing eyes and tears alike. An old woman stepped forward, holding out a single iron flower she had crafted from scrap metal. "The mountain does not forget," she whispered as a guard pushed her aside. Kalima met her gaze, and for the first time since her father's death, she smiled. "Nor do I," she murmured. As the procession wound its way toward the mines, clouds gathered above the peaks. The air thickened, heavy with the taste of rain and iron. The guards chained her to the central post, the same post where her father had been beaten years before, and left her beneath the open sky. The villagers watched from afar until the king's soldiers drove them back. Night fell and the silence of the mountain deepened. Kalima's wrists bled, but the hum beneath her skin grew stronger. She closed her eyes and listened. The chains were whispering, faint at first, then louder, forming words without voices. The metal sang of fire and freedom, of souls trapped within or waiting to be awakened. Then, far off in the distance, thunder cracked like the shattering of a gate. Lightning streaked across the horizon, splitting the dark sky into rivers of white fire. The chains around her vibrated violently, ringing like temple bells. Sparks flared where they touched the ground, and the iron post behind her trembled. The storm rolled down from the mountains, wild and unrestrained, as if answering an ancient call. Kalima lifted her face to the sky, rain mixing with the soot on her cheeks. The chains grew warm, no alive. Each link glowed with the color of dawn once more, pulsing to the rhythm of her heartbeat. The storm howled, tearing through the valley like the cry of 1,000 freed souls. And for the first time since her father's death, Kalima felt no fear. The mountain was speaking, the metal remembering, and the storm was listening. The same chains that marked her as a prisoner were beginning to stir, not as shackles but as something waiting to awaken. The guards dragged Kalima deep into the belly of the mountain, where the air was thick with smoke and despair. The tunnels of Ndora stretched endlessly, carved by generations of laborers whose songs had long since been silenced. Water dripped from the stone ceiling like the slow ticking of time. The chains around her wrists clinked softly with every step, faintly glowing with that strange hue of dawn. The soldiers shoved her into a hollow chamber carved into the rock, the punishment pit. "Let the mountain judge her," one of them muttered before slamming the iron gate shut. Their torches vanished into darkness, leaving her with nothing but the sound of her own breathing. The air was heavy with the scent of metal, earth, and sorrow. Kalima sat against the cold wall, her wrists throbbing beneath the weight of her shackles. Around her, the walls seemed to pulse with faint light, as if the stones themselves still remembered the fires that had birthed them. Above, the storm raged. She could hear thunder rolling through the veins of the mountain, shaking loose pebbles from the ceiling. Rainwater began to trickle down through the cracks, forming rivulets that ran over her feet and pooled around her. She tilted her head back, eyes closed, feeling the cold drops on her face. Then a flash. Lightning struck somewhere high above, and for a brief moment the entire mine glowed. Kalima's chains shone like molten fire, and in their gleam she thought she saw movement, faint silhouettes forming within the metal links. Her breath caught. The hum she had felt since her punishment was stronger now, deep and resonant, vibrating through her bones like a song half remembered. She closed her eyes again and whispered, "Father, if your soul lingers in the forge, show me what I must do." Sleep took her or something like it. In that space between dream and waking, she found herself standing in a vast hall of light and flame. The walls shimmered like molten gold, and at the center stood her father, strong and smiling as she remembered him. He wore the blacksmith's apron that had once been his pride, and in his hands he held a glowing chain, identical to the one that bound her. "Kalima," he said gently, his voice echoing like metal against metal. "Do you know why the mountain chose you?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because I defied the king?" He shook his head. "Because you listen. You have always heard what others could not, the whispers of the fire, the breath of the ore, the song within the hammer's strike. The mountain speaks through you." She reached for him, but her hands passed through light. "I'm bound, father. They took everything." "The metal remembers," he said, smiling sadly. "It remembers the hands that shaped it, the purpose it was meant to serve. You forged these chains, my daughter. They know your heart better than any king's command. They will not remain your prison forever. She looked down. The ground beneath her feet glowed with veins of molten red, pulsing with energy that seemed to match her heartbeat. Then what must I do? His form began to fade, his words carried by the rising wind. You must remember who you are, and the fire will remember you. A roar of thunder jolted her awake. She was back in the mine, her body soaked from the floodwater now filling the tunnel. The chains on her wrists were vibrating, singing softly in tones that resonated through the cavern. The sound was low at first, like a hum deep within the earth, then grew louder, echoing off the stone walls in perfect rhythm with the storm above. Her tears mixed with the rainwater, falling onto the metal links. The moment her tears touched them, the glow brightened, a faint spark crackled at the contact point, and the hum deepened into a living song. She gasped. It wasn't lightning that had awakened the metal, it was her grief, her longing, her love. The water around her shimmered, reflecting the light of the glowing chains. The iron gate rattled as though sensing the power gathering within the chamber. Kalima rose to her feet, her reflection in the water flickering between flesh and flame. She whispered, "The metal remembers." The chains tightened briefly, not to restrain her but as if in acknowledgement. Then they loosened again, humming louder, responding to her voice. Sparks flared between each link, casting ripples of light across the flooded walls. Outside, thunder cracked once more, shaking the mountain. Lightning raced down through the tunnels like veins of energy, striking the water at her feet. For an instant, the chamber was filled with blinding light. When it faded, steam rose around her in silvery threads. Kalima looked down and saw that the shackles on her wrists had changed. They no longer cut into her flesh, instead they fit perfectly, warm, alive, and pulsing like a heartbeat. She realized then that the mountain, the forge, the storm, all had converged in her. She was not bound to the chains, they were bound to her. In the silence that followed, the hum settled into a steady rhythm, like breathing. A faint glow illuminated the walls, and her father's voice echoed one last time, carried by the whisper of the storm. From your tears, the spark is born. Kalima lifted her head toward the crack of light above, her eyes reflecting the fire that now lived within her. The chains no longer represented captivity. They were her inheritance, the song of every broken soul that had ever toiled beneath the mountain, now awakening through her blood. The mines of Ndora had always been a place where silence ruled, a grave for forgotten voices and broken wills. Yet in that silence, a single note began to rise, faint, trembling, and alive. Kalima sat alone in her cell, her back against the cold stone wall, eyes closed. Her chains still glowed faintly from the storm that had passed. They pulsed with a quiet warmth as though waiting for something, for her. She began to hum. It was a sound she had not made in years, the low tune of the forge song her father used to sing while shaping iron. It was a melody of rhythm and heat, of life inside fire. The first hum came weak, breaking midway, but the second carried strength. As her voice lingered in the air, she felt the metal around her wrists shiver. Kalima stopped. The chains fell silent too. Her heart raced. Slowly she began again, this time softer, deliberate. The vibration returned, stronger now. The chains quivered as if remembering the rhythm of the hammer and anvil. Each note sent a pulse of light rippling down their length, spreading into the metal that bound her ankles, then the wall itself. She whispered, "You remember, don't you?" A faint metallic tone answered, not in words but in resonance. It was the sound of memory made real. Her hum deepened into a song, one she had only ever heard in dreams. The melody of her father's forge, mixed with her own heartbeat. The chains stirred, the metal links coiling and uncoiling like serpents waking from sleep. Her breath caught as the shackle on her left wrist loosened, turning with a slow, deliberate grace. The movement wasn't violent, it was reverent, like a bow. For the first time since her capture, Kalima smiled. Over the next few nights, she experimented with her gift. Each tone carried a command, each pause a choice. A hum could make the chains sway. A sharp exhale could make them tighten or twist. When she raised her pitch, the metal brightened, dancing like living flame. But it was not merely power, it was communion. She wasn't forcing the chains to obey, she was singing to them and they were answering in kind. They remembered her father's touch, her spirit's defiance, the rhythm of creation itself. Word spread quietly through the tunnels. Prisoners began to whisper of strange lights in the punishment pit, of songs that made the iron walls tremble. One by one they crept close to listen. Among them was an old miner named Jado, his back bent and hands scarred from years of labor. "Girl," he said in a hoarse whisper one night, What is that song? Kalima looked up from her chains. It's the song of the forge. My father's song. The song of remembering. Can you teach it? He asked, his eyes wide, reflecting the faint glow from her wrists. She hesitated. The gift had come from pain, from loss, but as she looked around at the hollow faces of those who had lost everything, she felt the answer rise within her. Yes, she said softly. But you must sing from your scars, not your fear. So she sang. Slowly the others joined in, broken voices at first, barely more than whispers. Yet as their tones merged, something miraculous happened. The walls of the mine seemed to hum back. The chains binding the other prisoners shivered in rhythm, glowing faintly in answer to Kalima's voice. The sound spread like a current through the tunnels, deep, resonant, powerful. It was not rebellion yet, it was remembrance. Every note carried the weight of ancestors who had once sung to the metal before the king's cruelty turned it into a tool of bondage. The guards noticed. They struck the prisoners, shouted at them to stop, but the song continued even in silence. It had become part of the metal, part of the earth itself. Days passed and Kalima's control deepened. She learned to shape her melodies. A low hum could unlock shackles. A high tone could make the metal move like water. Sometimes when she slept, the chains would shift on their own, coiling protectively around her like loyal creatures. The prisoners began calling her the chain singer. To them she was more than a symbol. She was proof that even in captivity spirit could forge freedom. They would whisper her name in reverence, Kalima of the Singing Chains. One night, as the moon's light seeped faintly through the cracks above, she gathered them all in the main cavern. The air was heavy with anticipation. She lifted her hands and began a new song, slow and sorrowful, rising from the depths of her chest. It was the song of the mountain itself, the one she had once heard in dreams. The entire mine trembled. Chains along the walls began to sway, glowing with the same dawn-colored hue that had marked her father's forge. Every prisoner felt their shackles grow warm, not burning but pulsing with life. The old miner fell to his knees, tears streaking his dirt-covered face. The metal lives, he whispered. Kalima's voice rose higher, echoing through the tunnels, filling every crevice with sound and light. It remembers us, she said between verses. It remembers who we were before they made us slaves. The walls shuddered in response, the chains vibrating as if ready to break free at her command. But Kalima did not seek escape that night. Instead, she smiled and lowered her voice to a whispering hum, calming the storm she had summoned. The chains stilled, glowing gently. Not yet, she murmured. Freedom must be forged, not stolen. As silence returned, the prisoners sat around her, their faces illuminated by the faint red shimmer of their bonds. For the first time in years, hope flickered in their eyes. Kalima leaned back against the stone wall, her voice fading into a soft lullaby. The chains around her wrist coiled loosely, humming a quiet reply. In that deep, endless darkness, a song was born, not of despair but of unity. The song of the chains. The chains that once dragged across the stone floor now moved with purpose. Kalima stood among the prisoners, her wrists glowing faintly with the light of awakening metal. The air was thick with heat and song, a strange rhythm that pulsed through the earth itself. The prisoners, once broken and hollow-eyed, now sang in unison. Their voices rose and fell like the strokes of a blacksmith's hammer, striking invisible anvils of rebellion deep in the mountain's heart. Each note was heavy with longing, forged by years of pain and buried hope. Kalima's voice led them, clear and strong, echoing against the damp tunnel walls. The chains around her wrists quivered, then lifted, alive and aware. They coiled gently like serpents ready to strike. The metal walls of the mine began to hum in answer, vibrating to the rhythm of her song. Dust fell from the ceiling. Cracks formed in the rock. Somewhere above, the guards heard the strange melody and laughed at first, until the laughter was swallowed by the rumble of trembling earth. The song deepened. Kalima closed her eyes, feeling the rhythm in her blood. The metal remembers the hands that shaped it. Her father's words echoed again. With each verse, the chains stretched, slid and reshaped themselves. They no longer felt cold or cruel, they felt alive, as if remembering their true purpose was never bondage but unity. Around her, men and women wept and smiled through tears, seeing their restraints glow in shades of dawn. When the first guard burst into the tunnel, torch raised and whip ready, the song shifted. Kalima lifted her chained hands. The lynx slithered across the ground, wrapping around the guard's legs. His torch dropped, the flames sputtering in the rising wind. The chains tightened, not killing, only holding, as if the metal itself chose restraint over blood. The guard shouted for help, but the others hesitated, fear mixing with awe. Kalima turned toward the prisoners and nodded. Together they sang louder. The tunnels erupted in shimmering light as every shackle, every link, every iron bar responded. The walls themselves seemed to breathe. Chains slid off ankles and wrists, lifting into the air like ribbons of molten silver. They weaved together into spirals and arcs, a dance of liberation under the mountain. More guards came, shouting, weapons clanging. But the metal was no longer theirs to command. Swords bent mid-swing. Helmets fell apart in their hands. The very gates that held the prisoners snapped open like the breaking of dawn. Kalima stood at the heart of it, her hair wild, her eyes burning with determination. The chains wound around her arms like armor, forming symbols that glowed faintly, not of servitude but of strength. The prisoners followed her, climbing through the crumbling tunnels toward the faint glimmer of light. Every step they took was met by the sound of humming iron, a chorus of the forgotten rising from the deep. The king's soldiers above ground heard the distant sound, not screams but singing, and that frightened them more than any army could. As they neared the surface, the wind from the storm outside swept into the tunnels, carrying the scent of rain and freedom. Kalima raised her arms one last time. The chains around her split into countless fragments that flew outward, shattering every lock, every shackle, every gate within the mines. The explosion of light blinded all who saw it. When the brilliance faded, the prisoners stood free among the rubble, the chains lying still at their feet, silent but glimmering with the hue of dawn. Kalima took a deep breath, the first taste of air untainted by dust and despair. The storm above raged, but within her there was calm, the peace of something newly forged. Around her, the freed souls gathered, staring in awe at the woman who had sung metal into mercy. And as thunder rolled once more across Ndora's mountains, it seemed to echo her song, a promise carried through iron and rain. The uprising in the deep was not just an escape. It was a rebirth. The tunnels groaned like dying beasts as Kalima led the survivors upward, each tremor threatening to swallow them whole. Dust filled the air, and the faint glow of her chains was the only light guiding their way. Behind her, the men and women she had freed stumbled but refused to stop. Every link that once bound them now floated faintly beside her, glowing like fireflies in the darkness. The song of the chains had faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of footsteps and heartbeats, the living proof of defiance. "Keep moving," Kalima urged, her voice hoarse but unbroken. The earth rumbled again and a section of the tunnel caved in behind them. The roar of falling rock drowned the screams, but Kalima did not look back. She could not. The storm above seemed to answer their struggle, sending flashes of lightning through cracks in the ceiling that momentarily lit the path ahead. The wind whistled through the broken shafts, carrying the scent of dawn. When at last they emerged from the final tunnel, the first light of morning broke over Ndora. The horizon burned in the color of her forged chains, not gold, not silver, but a soft, radiant hue between rose and flame. The survivors stood at the mouth of the mine, blinking against the brightness they had not seen in years. Some fell to their knees weeping. Others raised their hands to the sun as if it were a long-lost friend. Kalima stood silent, her chains shimmering softly in the morning air. The light of dawn kissed the metal, and it pulsed in return, as though alive with the spirits of those who had perished before freedom came. The kingdom below the mountain was no longer as she remembered. Smoke rose from the villages. Fields lay dry and cracked. The once proud banners of King Abadil hung torn and faded from the palace walls. The people wandered the streets in hunger and fear. The king's greed had poisoned the land. His mines had drained not only gold and ore but life itself from the soil. The chains of the people were no longer of metal but of despair. Kalima descended with her people into the valley. Word spread like wildfire, "The chain singer has returned." Peasants, miners, and beggars emerged from their huts to see her. Some bowed. Some touched the ground where she walked. The light of her chains reflected in their eyes, and hope flickered there for the first time in years. A child approached her, clutching a broken shackle, its edge rusted and sharp. "You broke the mountain," he whispered. Kalima knelt, taking the shackle from his small hands. It dissolved into light, merging with her own glowing links. With every soul she touched, the chains around her grew brighter, each link infused with the memory of freedom reclaimed. The survivors behind her sang softly, the same song that had shaken the mines. The melody rose over the kingdom, carried by the wind, awakening something deep within the hearts of the people. Women paused at their wells. Farmers looked up from their dry fields. The sound filled the air like rain after drought. From the palace walls, King Abadil watched in disbelief. He had sent thousands into those mines, believing none would return. Yet there she stood, the daughter of the blacksmith he had executed, wrapped in chains that glowed like fire and mourning. His guards shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. The sight of her made their weapons feel heavier, their armor colder. Kalima lifted her eyes to the palace that had taken her father, her freedom, her years. The chains around her wrists stirred, responding to her heartbeat. Each link carried the voice of a soul freed from bondage, hundreds of them singing through the metal in quiet harmony. She raised her hand, and the sound of the chains rippled through the air like the first breath of a storm. The people began to move, gathering behind her in a wave of unity. They carried no weapons, only faith and the rhythm of the song she had taught them. The mountain wind swept through the valley, scattering ash and dust as if clearing the way. Kalima took a step forward, her bare feet pressing into the earth that once enslaved her. The ground seemed to tremble in recognition. In that moment, the chains no longer looked like instruments of captivity. They gleamed as symbols of power, of connection, of memory, the binding thread between all who had suffered and survived. Kalima turned to her followers, her voice low but steady. "The metal remembers," she said. "And so do we." As the sun rose fully over Ndora, the light caught her chains and scattered into 1,000 colors across the valley. The people raised their voices, singing the song of freedom, the song of the mines, the song of the chain singer. And as the melody reached the trembling walls of the king's palace, it carried with it a promise, that dawn had come not just for the mountain, but for every soul beneath it. When word reached the Iron Palace that the slaves had risen and the mines had fallen silent, King Abadil's fury shook the marble floors. The sound of shattered goblets echoed through the throne room as he hurled his golden cup across the hall. "They dare defy the crown?" he roared, his voice deep and thunderous. "They dare raise the woman who forged my chains against me?" His courtiers bowed low, trembling, none daring to speak. Only his advisor, the same serpent-tongued man who had once accused Kalima of cursing the sacred chains, dared to lift his eyes. "Your Majesty," he murmured, "the people sing her name as if it were law. If we do not crush this fire now, it will consume the kingdom. Then we will drown the fire in molten iron," the king declared. "Prepare the army." From the forges beneath the palace, the soldiers of Ndora emerged clad in molten armor, the glow of their breastplates casting orange firelight into the night. Their shields bore the mark of the mountain, and their swords burned with black flame. The king himself rode at their head, his crown of iron polished to a cruel gleam. As they marched toward the valley, the earth trembled under the weight of their steps. The people of Ndora saw them coming, a wave of heat and hatred descending from the high gates. Fear rippled through the villages, but Kalima stood at the front of her people, silent and unmoving. The dawn-colored chains around her arms glowed softly in the dim light, whispering with unseen power. The survivors from the mines gathered behind her, their eyes steady, their hands clutching only the faith that had carried them through the darkness. When the king's army reached the fields of Iziara's edge, he raised his sword and shouted, "Bow, and I may let you live." His words rolled through the valley like thunder, but the only answer was the sound of wind, and then, softly, a hum. Kalima stepped forward, her bare feet brushing the dust, her chains coiling like living rivers around her body. The air shimmered as the melody of her voice spread outward, slow and mournful, like the echo of hammers striking anvils deep underground. The soldiers hesitated. The metal of their swords began to vibrate faintly, resonating with her song. They exchanged uneasy glances, tightening their grips. "Attack!" the king bellowed. But as the front line advanced, their blades bent in their hands, twisting like vines. Spears softened, helmets cracked, and armor glowed with unnatural heat. The soldiers cried out, throwing their weapons to the ground as the molten metal crawled from their skin, flowing toward Kalima like streams seeking their source. Her chains absorbed the molten tide, glowing brighter until the entire battlefield was bathed in gold and dawnlight. "No iron can rule the heart that forged it," she whispered, her voice carrying through every corner of the valley. The words were not shouted, yet they struck harder than any blade. The king watched in disbelief as his mighty army faltered before a woman wrapped in light. "Witch," he screamed, "you think your songs can defeat a kingdom?" Kalima raised her eyes to him, calm, unwavering, filled with something greater than anger. "I do not sing to defeat," she said. "I sing to awaken." The ground beneath the soldiers split, and from it rose the same chains that once bound thousands in darkness. They coiled around the king's army, not to strangle but to lift, tearing away the armor, freeing the men from the metal that had enslaved them. Some fell to their knees, sobbing. Others stared at their bare hands, trembling as they felt the weight of their freedom for the first time. The king's advisor tried to flee, but the earth itself refused to release him. The molten soil hardened around his legs, binding him where he stood. Kalima's chains circled him once, glowing softly, and his voice fell silent forever. King Abadil sat frozen on his horse, his crown glowing red from the heat of her power. The iron circlet that once symbolized his dominion began to melt, dripping down his face like tears of fire. He clawed at it, screaming as it fused with his skin. "You will bow before your king," he gasped, his voice cracking under the weight of his rage. Kalima stepped closer, each stride steady and deliberate. Her followers stood behind her in silent reverence. She looked upon the trembling monarch, the man who had killed her father, enslaved her people, and built a throne upon their pain. "You taught me that chains were power," she said softly. "But power without mercy is only madness." The king swung his sword one last time, but it shattered before it reached her. The shards hung in the air, caught in the invisible web of her will, then melted into glowing dust that drifted toward the sky like embers. Kalima turned her gaze upward. The dawn had deepened into gold, and the light danced upon her chains. "Let the metal remember," she murmured, "that it was never born to bind." And as she spoke, the soldiers who had once served the tyrant knelt, not in submission but in awakening. The song that had freed the minds now filled the open air, stronger and louder, a hymn that made even the mountains hum in harmony. By the time the last note faded, the king's army had laid down their weapons. The molten armor cooled and crumbled into earth. The people stood victorious, not through bloodshed but through the will of one woman whose voice had turned bondage into liberation. And above them all, the chains that once symbolized oppression shimmered softly, alive, radiant, and free. The royal forge blazed like a second sun, its molten heart roaring with fury as the mountains trembled around it. Smoke curled into the storm-dark sky, painting it crimson and gold. This was where it had begun, where chains were born, where souls were broken, and where Kalima would end it all. The wind carried the scent of fire and iron, and with every step she took toward the forge, her chains hummed faintly, as if remembering the countless cries forged into their links. King Abadil stood before the great furnace, his armor blackened by soot, his crown melted and reshaped into a helm of rage. In his hands he gripped the hammer of the ancestors, an ancient weapon said to hold the wrath of every king before him. The air rippled with its curse. With each movement, sparks flew like dying stars, and the ground smoked beneath his feet. "So, the blacksmith's daughter returns," he said, his voice cold and sharp as steel. "Do you come to beg or to burn?" Kalima's chains coiled gently around her arms, their glow steady, their whispers calm. "Neither," she replied, her voice carrying through the wind. "I came to remind you that the mountain remembers every strike, every soul you've buried beneath your greed." The king laughed, but the sound was brittle, hollow. "You think you can stand against the blood of kings? I am the anvil of destiny." He raised the hammer high, and the forge roared in answer. Flames leapt outward like beasts unleashed. Kalima closed her eyes for a heartbeat, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the heartbeat of the mountain that had endured generations of labor and pain. When she opened them, her gaze burned like molten silver. "And I," she whispered, "am the fire that frees what you've chained." The clash began with thunder. The king swung his hammer, and the air itself cracked with power. Kalima moved with the precision of a smith and the grace of a storm. Each strike of his hammer met the living rhythm of her chains, metal singing against metal, light against shadow. Sparks rained around them, illuminating the faces of freed slaves watching from the cliffs, witnesses to history reborn in flame. Abadil drove forward, his blows heavy enough to crush stone. Kalima's chains met them like waves, bending, twisting, absorbing each strike's fury. But the hammer was no ordinary weapon. Its curse drained warmth, light, and will. Slowly, her breath grew shallow, her arms trembling beneath the weight of the king's relentless assault. "Your father defied me once," the king hissed, his voice echoing with ancient wrath. "He thought his forge could shape fate. But fate belongs to kings." Kalima staggered, falling to one knee as her chains dimmed. "You're wrong," she said softly, gripping the glowing links. "Fate belongs to those who dare to shape it with their hands." The king lifted his hammer for the final blow. Lightning flashed above the forge, splitting the clouds as if the heavens themselves were watching. When the hammer fell, it struck her chain's dead center, and for a moment time froze. A sound like the cry of 1,000 anvils filled the air. The chains shattered, but not into fragments. Instead, they exploded into radiant shards that spiraled around her body, merging, reshaping, until they unfolded into wings of gleaming steel. The light from them flooded the valley, piercing through the smoke and ash. The watchers gasped, falling to their knees, shielding their eyes. Kalima rose slowly, no longer bound, her form illuminated from within. Her hair flowed like molten silver, and her wings shimmered with every color of dawn and dusk. She looked down at the king, her voice echoing like the toll of ancient bells. You used chains to bind. I used them to build. You struck to break, and gave me freedom instead. Abadil roared in fury, swinging his hammer again, but the weapon grew heavy in his grasp. The curse within it recoiled, sensing the purity of the light before it. His arm faltered. Kalima lifted her hand, and the wings unfurled with a blinding flare. The air itself turned molten, and the hammer began to melt, its cursed metal dripping from his hands like tar. No! The king screamed, trying to hold it together, but his own creation betrayed him. The molten hammer flowed upward, wrapping around him like living fire. The curse he had wielded for power now claimed him for justice. Kalima stepped closer, her wings folding gently behind her. The forge remembers its maker, she said softly, and it does not forgive cruelty. With a final cry, the king was consumed in his own fire. The forge trembled once more, then went silent, the endless roar finally stilled. Kalima stood before the dying flames, her wings reflecting the light of rebirth. The freed people gathered behind her, silent, awestruck. The mountain that had once echoed with pain now hummed with peace. She raised her hand, and the glowing wings dissolved into 1,000 shining fragments that drifted upward, settling over the land like falling stars. Let every link that once bound, she said, her voice carrying across the valley, become a key for those still searching for freedom. And as the dawn broke across the peaks of Ndora, her light crowned the kingdom. The woman who had been chained now soared above it all, the living spirit of her people's resistance, the song of iron reborn into freedom.